would a world where your life is controlled look like? What would a world where democracy falls and people's choice is traded for politics? And even worse, what would a world look like where everything you know is truly a lie? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'd just like to let you know that this world would be like 1984. Yes, the George Orwell story, 1984. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, people of all sexualities, identities, and more. And welcome back to another film review. And today's film review is 1984, of course. A George Orwell classic that was turned and adapted into a story. So without further ado, let's jump right into the video. Our story starts with a character called Walter. And Walter and his fellow brothers and sisters sit in a hall screaming at a screen of people they call traitors. Walter was played by the late great John Hurt, and as the story progresses, we begin to learn why they are screaming at the people on the screen. It turns out that all these people are the rebellion against the society that Walter lives in. These are people who fight for freedom, for moving forward, for being free to be who one wants to be. But, obviously, Big Brother doesn't believe that this is true in the story. Big Brother is always watching, and Big Brother knows everything. They know who you are, they know your routine, they know your daily cycle. Everything that you do is monitored down to Big Brother. Walter works in a office where they basically censor everything and every piece of information. But no matter how many times Walter chants the same chants, calls the same screams and the same cries, in the back of his mind, he knows that something is wrong, but he doesn't quite see it at first. After a while of doing the censorship at his local job, he begins to realize that something is up. One week he realizes that they are at war with one country, and the next week he realizes they're at war with another. One week the people his country is fighting are his allies, and one week they are his enemies. Something is not quite adding up to Walter. How can a country at war with you be an enemy and an ally at the same time? It just doesn't make sense. Walter knows this, but he says nothing. Instead, he decides to live out the rest of his life the way he has for the last so many years. He goes to work, he comes home, he goes to work. But all of a sudden, one day, his routine changes. So instead decides to go to an old antique shop where he usually picks up the blades that he uses to shave his face. In the antique store realizes that Walter is very interested in the old history before the Big Brother, before the Room 101, before the society that he lives in. The dates on the newspaper don't change, and Walter finds this strange. Every year is 1984. Every day is the same day. Walter is given a diary by the guy who owns the junk store. A diary about liberty, about freedom, about democracy. And Walter becomes more and more interested. Soon he realizes that there is a conflict in the philosophy of this book to the society he is living in. About saying his thoughts and feelings aloud, Walter decides to write it all down in a diary, in hopes that maybe some future generation, some person will come across it and will be able to take down the regime that he lives in. His rebellious side begins to break in, and his conditioning breaks along with it. Apologies to everyone, it's Winston in the story, sorry. So Winston then eventually falls in love with a young girl called Julia. Julia is a rebellious worker who manages to get a lot of things that people don't believe still exists. Things that most people would consider to be locked away in room 101. Winston and Julia's relationship begins to blossom, and the pair of them decide to share a room together. But little do they know how this will eventually play out for them. They share times together and go off into the wilderness, spending affectionate moments together, even though they know that the brotherhood and sisterhood of their society disagrees with such connections. It teaches them to stay away from each other. It teaches them that they should not reproduce. It teaches them that their only obligation is to Big Brother. But Winston and Julia have other ideas on this. They both disagree with it and both are madly in love with one another. They can't help but be attached to one another, and this eventually leads them to being caught, as the Thought Police had secretly bugged the room that they had shared and had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to catch them and finally put them to room 101. I know what you're almost probably asking me right now. Lewis, what's in room 101? I'll tell you. Room 101 is full of the most dangerous thing in the world. 101 is the reconditioning room. It's the room where anyone who believes they have any sense of freedom, sense of being, sense of belonging is taken. It's the place where the Big Brother finally degrade humanity down to its last principle. It takes what they believe to be freedom and democracy and begins to fade it and treat it as a lie. Winston is given a test. He is asked, if I put 4 fingers up, how many are there? And he replies, 4. But then Big Brother mocks him. If I said to you they were 5, would you believe me? Yes, he says, asking for the tortures to finally end. But how many fingers are there? 4. Big Brother then reminds him that there are 4 and 5 fingers. It's all a matter of who tells you and how you believe it. Winston begins to cry out. As he's prolonged through the torture, as he begins to fight back and rebel against the system, he begins to argue with his captor, pointing out that he believes that one day, someplace, somehow, the society will fall. Because that's how the world is. An endless cycle of good and evil. There is no one can win over the other. Winston honestly believes that one day the rebellion will win and the fake news will end. Sadly for him, this is not the case in this story, or at least at this point in time. Winston is degraded so much that he's even put on a TV board where he is told to admit to his crimes and admit to giving certain diseases that he obviously didn't. He is reconditioned so much that he is eventually sent back to the world, but lost of his memories of freedom, lost of his memories of wanting to escape, lost of his own humanity. He becomes another part and another pawn in the game. He just becomes another foot soldier, listening to the same rhetoric, chanting the same slurs, living the same lie. In the torture, Winston is pushed to the edge. He thinks only of Julia, even in every moment as he tries to grasp to the edge, as he tries to hold on to his humanity. He finds himself still believing in the woman he loves. But it can't be. He is tortured to the ability in which they poison his mind of the woman he loves. They show him an image of her dying. They blind him to the truth of the situation. They begin to poison him into believing that she is the reason for everything that's gone wrong. She is the reason in which he has been punished. She gave him up. She left him for dead. All these things and more are poisoned into Winston's mind, and eventually he begins to believe it. Horrified by what could really be true, he begins to be brainwashed into believing that Julia really was the cause of all of his problems. After all of the reconditioning, after all of the torture, Winston and Julia are rehabilitated back into society as members of the Union. They go back to their community and their respective jobs. They live the lie. But they both have a subtle hint of knowledge to each other's predicament. Julia admits to giving up Winston. Winston admits to knowing this. He also admits to hating her. But somehow, some way, their love slightly slipped through as the pair reconcile the fact that they may meet again someday, just not at that present time. What did I think of 1984? Well, it was an old film about a really good book. I've got to say, it really hits the stone run from the beginning. To see a society how it could collapse into such hatred, such blind false hopes of believing that this party is working for the benefit of the people, really does show how the world could be driven. 1984 is a great message to Orwell's point of view on censorship. He clearly establishes the problem with censorship in the factor that two news sides could manipulate a story. He presents his argument through means of war, warfare, conflict, and much more. He points out that one country could blind their people and another country could buy into it. He also points out how people could be easily manipulated into believing 4 is 5 or 5 is 4 or vice versa in the conspiracy of them being fed false lies about their history. Through Winston and Julia's eyes, we get to see how one could be driven by all the no's in life, all the little things that you would be stopped from doing. One's inhibitions could be enlightened, and experimentation could become a possibility to people. Thus, the desires all being locked away inside of one human being. How it could drive one mad. Just because a society is perfect doesn't mean it doesn't have its flaws. And this is the great thing about 1984. It really highlights how people's viewpoints can either be a bad thing or a good thing. They can either hate one another or they can love one another. And that is the great message that is followed throughout this whole film. And for that reason, I'm going to give 1984 a solid 9 out of 10. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next film review. Until then, stay beautiful.